Pulitzer Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Christopher Knight?
Speaking.
Christopher, what a pleasure to have you on the line. It is Paul Holdengräber.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
I am very well. It's such a pleasure to have you on the line. Thank you for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm delighted that we were able to make that happen, or rather that you agreed to make this happen. Tell me, where do I find you now?
I'm in the desert, just outside of Palm Springs, California.
My goodness! So you've really removed yourself from Los Angeles for the moment. Have you been there for a long time?
I've been here since mid-March. We decided to stay here. The desert, with the pandemic going on, seemed like a pretty good option because the population density here is so low. The place where we are, population, there's about 750 people per square mile. And right. In Los Angeles, it's about 7,500 per square mile. So that seems like a good idea. It's sort of peculiar, though, and in a kind of upside down way, because the median age in the desert area where we are is about 66. So it's as far as COVID-19 goes, it's a much more vulnerable population in a much safer area. So it's a really strange kind of mix. I mean, in LA, the median age is about 35, right? Which is a less vulnerable population in a hugely dense area. So it's a really strange kind of mix.
I imagine you've never been in the desert for so long.
True. That's true. Usually, LA was still the base of operation, but it's been nice being here. It's kind of watching the world from a distance and visiting the city periodically for work.
Let's talk about watching the world from a distance. On March 29th, you wrote something that I found fascinating. You said, plagues have a way of focusing the mind. What does that focus entail? I really would like you to scrutinize that comment.
Well, when you're dealing with a plague, you're dealing with an existential threat that is beyond comprehension in some respects. It's certainly beyond control. And the kind of consciousness one has to have in going out the front door to move around in the world is completely different at a time of pandemic. Knowing that leaving the house can be the end of the line if you're not careful, makes one really conscious. When you're wearing a mask, when you're wearing gloves, when you're eyeing complete strangers at the supermarket, it's just a whole different experience of being in the world, of dealing with other people. It's when I say focusing the mind, I think it's also exhausting in a way. staying indoors, staying in the house, I find it hard to focus on what I'm working on, or what I'm reading, or my mind tends to wander off to other places rather than focus. And I think that's a reaction to having to be so focused when you leave the house. It's hard to grasp, hard to articulate.
Do you remember in what context you used that sentence? It's so interesting. You used it in the context of talking about a book which I must read, by Millard Meese. And I find it it sounds like an extraordinary book written in the 1950s, which I didn't know about at all. And you say, just ask Millard Meese. I admit that's a guy I haven't thought of in ages. And it seems like he was talking about a very different pandemic in a very different century, but it seems to me so interesting that the pandemic also probably in some form or fashion has changed the way you look at what you look at, which is art. You say about the Chirico, now the paintings look a bit different, and I'd like to ask you, how so?
Well, the De Chirico reference was from a different piece when I was taking the time to organize my library.
Right. Your 2,000 books.
Right. And as I was reshelving things, I pulled down a number of De Chirico books. One of which was a catalog from retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, 25 years ago. And suddenly, I was looking at a picture on the cover, and it was of as De Chirico does, of a town square in Italy that was abandoned and empty, and had a train off in the distance, and dark shadows everywhere, and the perspective of the ground plane was off, as if the whole ground was beginning to buckle. And at that time, when the pandemic was rampaging through Italy, suddenly these looked like documentary paintings rather than metaphysical paintings from 100 years ago. So the way in which one experiences the present, has an effect on the way one reads art from the past. And Millard Meese, I think did something similar in his book, which was about the Black Death in Florence and Siena in the 14th century. The Black Death had a really profound impact on the way the culture was developing and the way painting was developing at the time, and that's what the book is about. And Meese sort of brought a study of economics and philosophy and social systems and all of that into the study of art history, which for an American art historian writing after World War II was really unique and had a really kind of profound impact. But one of the things that occurred to me was that Meese himself, he started working on the book in 1946, I think it was, 46 or 47, and the book was published in 51. Meese had just come through a catastrophe that was even bigger than the Black Death in Florence and Siena, and that was World War II, right, when tens of millions of people were slaughtered. And the degree to which that kind of upheaval and chaos kind of seeps into the way one operates may well have had an influence on his looking at his discipline. He was principally a medievalist. Late Gothic was his area, and the pandemic arrived at the end of Late Gothic, and changed life basically. It was also interesting to me in doing some research on that, and it's a book I had read in graduate school and found really important and enlightening. Was that being a medievalist, being a sort of first generation American art historian of a very rigorous kind, was also a trustee, a museum trustee, not at the Met, not at the National Gallery. He was a trustee at the Museum of Modern Art. And I thought, how interesting that a brilliant medievalist would be invited to be a trustee of a modern museum. It's something that seems so far afield to the museum world today. I was really taken aback when I learned that. It's really interesting.
A small digression. You mentioned the Chirico. I'm wondering what you make, Christopher, as a principal art critic of the LA Times, of this craze now, this craze, one might say, and hunger for Edward Hopper.
Frankly, I don't quite get it. It seems sort of, how can I say? I think Hopper's misunderstood in a lot of ways. I think people tend to look at Hopper as Hopper's paintings as epitomizing loneliness, and they've never spoken that way to me. To me, they've spoken about being alone, which is different than being lonely. And there's an aloneness in his work that is what I'm attracted to about it. But I think when people are staying at home, to look at Hopper it's almost narcissistic in a way. It's almost like seeing a picture of yourself. But I do think the distinction between being alone and being lonely is important to make. And one of maybe I make that distinction, and maybe that aspect of Hopper appeals to me because I'm a writer, and writing is something that's done when you're alone. I think those paintings, in some respects, represent what a painter does in the studio too. A concentration that comes from being alone.
What a fascinating distinction. I had to ask you this question because I'm seeing it everywhere, and it nearly feels like selfies. People are sort of in looking at Hopper, they're sort of seeing themselves at this moment when it might be something quite different. You recently wrote in an article that society will change with the pandemic, and art will too, in ways we can only begin to guess. I'd love you to begin to guess in what ways you think they might. I might say they might, and Christopher, I might say they should change.
Yeah, well, I have to warn you that my crystal ball is broken.
Okay.
I don't quite.
You don't quite know.
I do. Yeah, I expect the artist to tell me. I expect art to tell me how it's changed and how we change. I think that as a critic, one of the things that I really attempt to do is to shut up and listen with my eyes and my body. And I'm not into being a stage manager or a stage director for artists. But they too, I mean, also one of the things that I had a conversation with an artist about who pointed out that the overwhelming majority of artists don't make their living from their work. They have other jobs. But the peculiarity of this particular moment when many of those jobs have been furloughed or removed, and those artists aren't working second jobs, is that they're in their studios. They're in their studios for periods of time and attention that they haven't had a chance to experience before. So his observation was that inevitably what artists are doing in their studios is going to change just because the dynamic has changed. That concentrated periods of work result in different outcomes. So it'll be interesting to see whether that happens or how that happens.
No, and I appreciate your response, a very measured response, reminding me a little bit of Mark Twain's wonderful comment that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So I think you, Christopher, in this particular case, you're in very good company, and I appreciate the comment also because, in a way, it goes to something that I've always very much liked in your work, which is to look also at the social implications. And I know that you, like some people, are quite concerned by the ways in which museums at this moment are behaving, as it were, or misbehaving perhaps, with their staff. So in a way, the social implications of what this pandemic has brought about. So many people have been let go. And one begins to wonder why. I mean, is it just the bottom line, or is it something else? And how have some museums behaved better, and what are the museums that are behaving badly? What will they come back to?
Yeah, that's a really concerning question. The mess that we're in at the moment with this confluence of the pandemic and the protests and all of that really comes out of a social situation of the grossest decadence imaginable. When people talk about, a second Gilded Age, well, it all sounds very, kind of remote and glittery and so on. But the decadence is profound. It's just absolutely profound, and can be, in the art world, can simply be, be witnessed by the fact that the art market leads so much of our cultural life around by the nose. And it's an art market that is so out of control and so gigantic that it's hard to even wrap your head around. And with all of that money sloshing around, and with museums engaged in corralling as much of that money as possible for their own operation, not to put your staff at the top of your priority list in terms of getting through this pandemic period, I think is unconscionable. The amount of tax deduction that a billionaire gets for donating to a museum would probably employ, tons and tons of people at that institution for X number of months to get them through this problem. And not to consider that as the first way to go is really disappointing. And to give you not an example of, let's see, how will I explain this? The kind of clout that museums have. The LA County Museum, when the pay protection plan or whatever that congressional bill was, the Paycheck Protection Plan, when that went online, the county museum applied for one of those loans for a small business. Program was announced on a Friday, and by Monday morning, the LA County Museum had been granted one of those loans to protect its staff, which is terrific that the staff was able to be taken care of through this government program. It was a fraught program with all kinds of problems and all kinds of issues, and many, many, many places that deserved it couldn't get it, and on and on and on. But when I learned that happened, my first thought was, since when is the Los Angeles County Museum of Art a small business? Supposedly the small businesses would have a limit of 500 employees. The LA County Museum has 550. A small business, a museum that's considered a small business by the federal government, has a budget below $28.5 million. The county museum's budget is in excess of $70 million. How did they get this grant? How did they get the money? Well, obviously, it's because they have hundreds of millions of dollars invested in banks, and billionaires on the board invested in banks, and hedge fund managers on the board with tens of billions of dollars invested in banks. So, of course, when they pick up the phone to get to get a bank to be involved in this program, the bank is going to listen. Whereas a place like Self-Help Graphics in Boyle Heights or the Institute of Contemporary Art in downtown Los Angeles, they're going to call up and probably no one's going to answer the phone. So the inequities are, head spinning.
No, I mean, just reading now, LACMA is one such institution, but reading about so many of the museums that are really, really suffering. I read about the SF MoMA, and you yourself wrote about MoCA, and so many people, losing their jobs. You have thought so much about LACMA, and I think they are in this time of distraction going forward with all of their plans, as it were, it seems. And one of the criticisms you voiced against LACMA, and I should probably say that in my younger years, I used to work for LACMA. So I have a bit of an insider's view of it, but really only a little bit because it's 2 decades ago, really. But one of your criticisms is that LACMA is scattering, as it were, its collection. And I'm wondering why you think it's important that such a collection remain as much as possible in one location.
Well, I'm a big believer in art museums being embedded in the community in which they exist, which sounds like I would be a fan of dispersing the collection to satellites all over Los Angeles. When in fact, what I mean is that the museum needs to be a reflection of the polyglot urban environment in which it exists. Any person in Los Angeles ought to be able to come to their museum and see themselves reflected in it, and to be able to walk from one room to another room and encounter a completely different culture, one that is presumably totally alien to their own existence, and to discover there something in themselves, something with which they connect. And you can only do that if the collection is in one place. If if things are dispersed all over one of the biggest counties, urban counties in America, then that's lost. That experience is lost. There's also the practical question. Frank, to be perfectly frank, I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime, that there's going to be these satellites of LACMA all over the city. Just the expense is too immense. They can't seem to marshal the financial resources to operate in one place, never mind in 10 places around the city. But that remains to be seen. I think there's a great value. If I can use the analogy of a library, which I often do for museums, because for me a museum is for art what a library is for books. It'd be like going to the encyclopedia on your bookshelf and reading something in volume C that makes you wonder about something else that would be in volume W, but volume W isn't there. It was off somewhere else, and so you can't look it up. That would drive me crazy.
Well, Christopher, I lived this. I grew up, insofar that I did grow up. I grew up in Belgium, where they separated the Flemish and the Walloon separated the second oldest university in the world, Louvain, in two, Louvain-la-Neuve and Louvain-la-Veuve, and they separated it in the most outstanding way, where you would have volume 1, 3, 5, and 7 in one library, and two. So it's a Belgian joke. I had to drive 30 kilometers, 20 miles if I wanted to look up something with the letter C. So this has been done. There is a precedent. I have so many more questions for you, but I'll ask you one. You are now 100 miles away from Los Angeles, and at some point, in all probability, you will come back. And you have written something that I agree with, and we could talk about it for a long time, that art does not heal, but it does offer solace, which made me think very much of David Mitchell's line that books don't offer real escape, but they can stop a mind scratching itself raw. When you come back to Los Angeles, if you close your eyes now for a second, which is the one painting that you feel you will need to visit that might offer that kind of solace?
Oh boy, that's a tough one.
I'll give you two.
You give me two, okay. Let me see. When I say solace, I don't necessarily mean that the painting is an image of tender beauty, tender buttons.
I would imagine.
The James Ensor entry of Christ into Brussels. Speaking of,
yeah,
I think has a lot going for it in terms of where we are now, and it's anything but an image of peace and serenity. It's dread chaos, and then at the same time, the Georges de la Tour Magdalene with a Smoking Flame at LACMA is one of those. It's just one of those paintings that you can sit and stare at for a very long time.
And it will be very interesting to see how you see it now, to talk about the ways in which maybe we're transformed by trauma, the kind of trauma we're living through now, and how, as an art critic, you will maybe notice new things. And Christopher, I wish we could talk much, much longer. I can't wait to see you again. And at the end of this program, I want to congratulate you wholeheartedly on your Pulitzer Prize.
Thank you.
I was so pleased when it was awarded to you, and I wish you well. And it's really been a pleasure speaking with you. And I'm going to look at those two paintings. I know one of them better, the Ensor, I know a little bit better, but I'm going to look at both of those paintings, and I thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking with me, and take good care and stay safe.
Thanks, Paul. You too. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Christopher.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, Go to dublab.com/support